There was a time when Chris Rock could make the entire world laugh just by raising an eyebrow. His razor-sharp wit, his fearless jokes, his unfiltered honesty, they made him one of the most iconic comedians of our generation. But behind the laughter, behind the bright lights of the stage and the applause of millions, there's been a quiet pain Chris has carried for years. Now at 60, the truth about his life, his heartbreak, and his battles has begun to emerge. And it's far more tragic than anyone ever imagined. From his lonely childhood in Brooklyn to the struggles of fame, from betrayal in love to the scars of public humiliation, Chris Rock's story is one of survival in a world that often refused to understand him. What really happened to Chris Rock, and why are fans saying his tragedy is beyond heartbreaking? Let's uncover the truth behind the laughter. Before Chris Rock became the voice of modern comedy, before he stood on stage commanding laughter with every perfectly timed pause, he was just a kid in Brooklyn, small, shy, and bullied relentlessly. Born in Andrews, South Carolina, but raised in the rough neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Chris was the eldest of 7 children. His father, Julius, worked multiple jobs, while his mother, Rosalie, devoted her life to raising the family. But the world outside their small home was harsh. Chris was bused to schools in predominantly white neighborhoods, where he faced racial abuse on a daily basis. He was spat on, mocked, and even beaten simply for the color of his skin. Years later, Chris would reveal that those experiences didn't just scar him, they shaped his humor. "I realized early on," he once said, "that being funny was my only weapon." Comedy became his armor. As a teenager, Chris found refuge in humor, using his sharp tongue to fight back against the cruelty he endured. He idolized Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy, studying their performances like a student of war. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had started performing stand-up in small New York clubs, pouring his pain into laughter. His early sets were raw, honest, and often uncomfortable. Not just jokes, but reflections of survival. Eddie Murphy discovered him one night and brought him into the world of Hollywood, giving him his first taste of success with Beverly Hills Cop 2. For a moment, it seemed like the kid who grew up invisible was finally being seen, but with visibility came new challenges. The world expected Chris Rock to be funny, always. What people didn't see was the deep sadness behind the smiles. Despite his fame, Chris often spoke about feeling like an outsider, even in Hollywood. His comedy, though brilliant, was born out of pain. Pain from a father he lost too soon, pain from a world that mocked his difference, and pain from constantly needing to prove his worth. When his father died suddenly in 1988 from an ulcer, Chris was devastated. The man who had held the family together was gone, and Chris was left with a void that no amount of applause could fill. As his fame grew, so did the pressure. The entertainment industry demanded more jokes, more appearances, more headlines. And yet in private, Chris struggled with anxiety, loneliness, and the lingering trauma of his youth. Every time he stepped on stage, the audience saw brilliance. But when the lights dimmed, Chris was often left alone with the echoes of laughter that no longer comforted him. His comedy was therapy, but it also reminded him of the wounds he could never quite heal. Chris Rock once said, "You don't get to be funny without pain. You just don't." Those words now feel prophetic. Behind every punchline, there was a man trying to make sense of a life that had never been easy. And as we'll soon discover, the greatest tragedies of his life were still waiting ahead. In love, betrayal, and a shocking public moment that would change everything. By the time Chris Rock hit his 40s, he was no longer just a comedian, he was a cultural icon. From Saturday Night Live to The Chris Rock Show and blockbuster hits like Grown Ups and Madagascar, he seemed untouchable. But success in the spotlight often casts deep shadows behind the curtain. And for Chris, that darkness was beginning to close in. His marriage to Malak Compton Rock, a respected philanthropist, appeared to be picture perfect. They had 2 beautiful daughters, a luxurious home, and a life that seemed stable amid the chaos of fame. Yet, as the cameras flashed, their marriage quietly began to fracture under the weight of fame, temptation, and personal demons that Chris himself could no longer ignore. In interviews years later, Chris would admit that the collapse of his marriage was one of his life's greatest failures, and that it was entirely his fault. "I was not a good husband," he confessed with brutal honesty. "I cheated." End of story. Those 3 words carried decades of regret. Behind closed doors, Chris struggled with infidelity, emotional distance, and an inability to connect with the very people he loved most. Fame had offered him everything, yet it also stole something essential: his humility, his grounding, his peace. "You think because you're famous you can get away with anything," he said. "But you can't escape yourself." As the marriage deteriorated, Chris tried to hide his pain behind humor. On stage, he joked about relationships, love, and divorce, but the laughter only masked his growing despair. The man who could make millions of people laugh could not fix the silence that had settled in his home. When the divorce became public in 2016, it was messy, painful, and deeply personal. Years of shared history were laid bare for the world to judge. Malak, who had stood by him through the highs and lows of his career, was heartbroken. And Chris, for the first time, had to confront the wreckage he had caused. After the divorce, Chris entered what he described as the darkest period of his life. He began therapy, something he'd avoided for years, to confront the wounds he had buried beneath layers of fame and performance. "I had to rebuild from scratch," he said in one interview. "I had to learn to sit with myself, and I didn't like the company." Therapy forced him to revisit not just his failed marriage, but the trauma of his childhood, the bullying, the racism, the loneliness. He realized that he had spent his entire life trying to prove his worth, to earn love through success and laughter, but never through vulnerability. His comedy, once sharp and fearless, became reflective and raw. The world saw a different Chris Rock, older, wiser, and deeply human. He spoke openly about addiction, temptation, and emotional pain, becoming a voice for men who struggled silently with their flaws. The man who once defined himself by his ability to make others laugh was finally learning how to be honest with himself. Still, the road to healing was far from over. The world would soon witness another moment, one that would redefine how people saw Chris Rock forever. It would happen live in front of millions, and it would test his composure, his character, and his spirit in ways he could never have imagined. The night of the 94th Academy Awards in 2022 was supposed to be just another glamorous evening in Hollywood. Chris Rock was invited to present an award, something he'd done many times before. He walked onto the Oscar stage with his trademark swagger, delivering jokes with the effortless charm that made him a legend. But no one, not even Chris himself, could have predicted that within moments, the ceremony would spiral into one of the most shocking and talked about moments in entertainment history. As Chris cracked a light-hearted joke about Jada Pinkett Smith's shaved head, referencing G.I. Jane, a movie character known for her bald look, the audience chuckled. But in an instant, the room froze. Will Smith, one of the most beloved figures in Hollywood and a longtime friend of Chris, suddenly stormed onto the stage. Before anyone could react, Smith struck Chris across the face with an open hand, a slap that echoed through the Dolby Theatre and sent shockwaves around the world. The cameras caught it all: the stunned expression on Chris's face, the uncomfortable silence that followed, and Will's furious shout from the audience, "Keep my wife's name out of your expletive mouth!" Millions watched in disbelief as Chris, visibly shaken yet composed, responded with remarkable restraint. "Wow, Will Smith just smacked the expletive out of me," he said, trying to diffuse the tension with humor. He stood there, silent for a few seconds that felt like hours, then calmly continued presenting the award as if nothing had happened. That moment changed everything. Overnight, Chris Rock became a symbol, not just of professionalism and grace under pressure, but of what it means to take a public hit and stand tall anyway. Social media exploded, news outlets ran endless headlines, and fans divided into camps. Some defended Will's outburst as emotional, others hailed Chris's calm as heroic. But behind that composed face, Chris was hurting. Friends later revealed that he suffered from sleepless nights and recurring flashbacks, struggling to process the humiliation of being attacked on live television. "It was like being hit by the biggest man in the world while the world watched and did nothing," he would later say in his Netflix special. Chris didn't immediately respond publicly. For months, he stayed quiet, refusing interviews and declining to make statements. That silence spoke volumes. It was his way of taking back control. When he finally did address it, it was on his own terms. In his 2023 Netflix special Selective Outrage, Chris turned pain into art. He dissected the moment with surgical precision, combining humor, anger, and reflection. "Everybody called me a victim," he said, "but I'm not a victim. I took that hit like Pacquiao." It was vintage Chris Rock, unapologetically raw, brutally honest and painfully funny, yet beneath the laughter was a man who had endured a lifetime of being hit, emotionally, psychologically, and now, literally. The slap wasn't just an isolated moment. It was a culmination of years of silent battles, racism, heartbreak, betrayal, and the constant expectation to be the funny one, no matter what pain he carried. It stripped away the mask and revealed the human beneath the legend. That night became a defining chapter in Chris Rock's story, not because of what happened, but because of how he handled it. It proved that strength isn't always about fighting back. Sometimes it's about standing tall when the world tries to knock you down. In the aftermath of the Oscars incident, Chris Rock's life entered a new and unexpected chapter, one not defined by scandal, but by survival and self-reflection. The slap may have been the spark, but what followed was a fire of transformation. For months, Chris avoided interviews and media appearances, choosing instead to let time and silence heal what the world had seen shatter in seconds. But beneath that calm exterior, he was rediscovering something far more valuable than fame: his peace, his truth, and his resilience. When Chris finally re-emerged into the spotlight, he wasn't the same man. He wasn't just the sharp-tongued comedian who made audiences laugh until they cried. He was a man who had been broken in front of millions and found the strength to rebuild himself with dignity. During his Selective Outrage comedy tour, he spoke openly about the slap, not to rehash the pain, but to reclaim the narrative. "I'm not a victim," he told the audience. "I took that hit like a man." That one line captured the essence of who Chris Rock had become, someone who could turn humiliation into humor and hurt into healing. But beyond the stage lights and applause, Chris's life became deeply introspective. He spoke about undergoing intense therapy, facing the trauma he had long buried since childhood, the bullying, the racism, and the internalized pain that had followed him for decades. He shared how, even as a successful adult, he struggled with trust, love, and vulnerability. "I used to think success fixed everything," he said in a later interview. "But success just exposes the cracks you refuse to fix." For the first time, fans saw Chris not just as a performer, but as a human being, flawed, honest, and deeply self-aware. Away from the chaos of Hollywood, Chris focused on being a better father to his daughters, Lola and Zara. He admitted that for years, he had been physically present but emotionally distant, caught up in the noise of his own fame. Now he was determined to change that. "They saved me," he once said softly. "When I didn't feel like I had a reason to get up, they were my reason." It was this kind of vulnerability, rare, raw, and deeply moving, that showed just how far Chris had come from the man who once hid behind jokes to escape his pain. In many ways, the tragedy of Chris Rock's life was never about one single event. Not the divorce, not the slap, not even the personal demons he faced. It was about how fame amplified his suffering and forced him to heal in front of an audience. Yet that same fame gave him a platform to speak for those who suffer silently. Through his work, his honesty, and his resilience, Chris has become an unexpected symbol of endurance, a man who turned public pain into private growth. Today, at 60, Chris Rock stands not just as one of the greatest comedians of all time, but as a survivor of Hollywood's harshest realities. His story reminds the world that laughter can be a weapon, a shield, and sometimes a medicine. Beneath the jokes lies a man who has fought through betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation, and still found a way to rise. And perhaps that's the true legacy of Chris Rock, a man who proved that even when life hits you in front of millions, your greatest punchline can still be your comeback.